700 years ago, during the Middle Ages, a great pandemic exterminated a third of Europe's population. It was the Black Death. In this video, I'm going to tell you about its origins, its consequences, and how it was eventually stopped. The origin of this disease can be found in a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic plague and pneumonic plague. This little bugger is the second most deadly infectious agent in history. Only malaria has killed more people. The Black Death is a rodent disease which affects rats in particular. Many of them die, but the survivors become a hazard because the fleas and lice which bite these infected rats then transmit the disease to other rodents and also to human beings. Everything seems to indicate that the Black Death's origin was somewhere in China. At that time, the Mongols controlled the country and had established the Yuan dynasty. In the 1300s, there was a little ice age which may have caused many rodents to abandon their dry pastures and venture into populated areas. It was there that the disease made the jump to humans through their accompanying fleas. According to some sources, starting in 1331, China suffered a devastating plague which killed around 25 million people. Later, the plague reached Central Asia, where the steppe nomads used to hunt marmots and other rodents which also carried the disease. The nomads ate these animals and dressed in their pelts. So naturally, the fleas feasted like the hungry bloodsuckers they are, and many more humans contracted the plague. Oh, and just to make things worse, this area happened to be right on the Silk Road with a constant traffic of traders and goods. It is known that the city of Kaffa, nowadays called Feodosia, in Crimea, on the shores of the Black Sea, was attacked by the Mongols of Jani Beg's Golden Horde. In the year 1346, the besiegers of this Genoese enclave began to fall prey to the plague. How did the Mongols react then? Did they retreat? Hell no! Instead, they went full Lord of the Rings, loading their catapults with the corpses of plague victims and launching them over the walls of Kaffa so they would fall into the city and infect the population. Nice. Many Genoese fled by boat, but unfortunately some also carried the disease with them. Those boats passed by Constantinople, Alexandria, and eventually reached Italy, causing the first big outbreak in Western Europe. Seriously, it seems that China and Italy are always the ones to get shafted by infectious diseases. As we said, the first large outbreak was in the city of Messina in the island of Sicily, which at the time was controlled by the Kingdom of Aragon. The rest of Italy was comprised by the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, and the north was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And then of course there were independent republics like Venice and semi-independent ones like Pisa, Florence and Genoa. Naturally, those Genoese sailors tried to return to their home, but when they arrived at the port of Genoa, the rumors of a plague had already reached the city and they were turned away by fire arrows. The infected boats were then forced to seek other ports in the south of France and Catalonia, spreading the disease even more. In that very same year, 1347, King Louis I of Hungary declared war on the Kingdom of Naples, ruled by Joanna I of Naples. The queen was married to the Hungarian king's brother, Andrew, who was murdered, but it's not quite clear whether this was ordered by the queen or not. The important part is that Louis I's campaign was a failure, and his troops had to return to Hungary, many of them infected with the plague. By 1348, the Black Death had extended throughout all of Italy, most of the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of Aragon, and the Balkans, including Greece. The following year, it affected Castile, northern France, Germany, England and Eastern Europe, although Bohemia in Eastern Germany and a large part of Poland were mostly spared. The same happened in Scandinavia, where it seems that the climate was not too favorable for fleas seeking to infect humans. The symptoms of the Black Death were very high fever, shivering, nausea, bloody cough, deep thirst, bleeding through every bodily orifice, feeling of exhaustion, and the appearance of very painful black buboes on the skin. These buboes were caused by inflammation of the lymph nodes, which, when they eventually burst, oozed a dark fluid and smelled very badly. This earned the disease the name of the Black Death, since mortality reached around 80%. People used to die 5 days after displaying the first symptoms.
Pam, 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 pam y a cascarla.
For starters, the Black Death was a kind of plague with a very high incubation period, which could reach up to 12 days. But it seems that back then it was even longer, or so the doctors deduced. That meant that a person could contract it and not show any signs of being ill for more than 2 weeks. But of course, throughout that time they could be infecting hundreds or even thousands of others wherever they went. There were no rapid tests or shit like that in the Middle Ages. Then we also have problems in the socio-political context. Several European nations were busy fighting the 100-Year War. a devastating conflict between France and England. Asia and the Middle East were pretty much the same, or even worse, since the Mongols were busy destroying everything, including the city of Baghdad, the most modern metropolis of its time. The region had descended into a chaos of small and weak states. And then there were other problems, because, as we mentioned earlier, a little ice age began around the year 1300. This was really shitty luck, because it destroyed crops all over the continent, leading to famine and malnutrition. And of course, when people are starving and malnourished, they cannot hope to fight back any disease, because their immune system is completely screwed up. If the plague had arrived maybe 50 years earlier, it would have still been a bitch, just like other plagues throughout history, but it certainly wouldn't have been so deadly. In fact, at that time, Europe had been plague-free for around 600 years. The last one was the plague of Justinian in the year 542, which mostly affected the Byzantine Empire until the year 750. It is believed that its origin may have been somewhere in East Africa, but that is not completely certain. Then we have the issue of cities, where the plague caused the most damage. Microbes will always spread more in places with a higher population density, and if on top of that hygiene is quite spotty, as was usually the case in those large cities, then it's a disease slum dunk. That said, I want to clarify that it is completely false that people in medieval Europe were filthy buggers who never washed. I've already mentioned that, indeed, some districts of some medieval cities had very poor hygiene, and that surely contributed to spread the disease. That is true. What is not true is that every inhabitant of every district and town in medieval Europe never bathed, and even less that this was because the church said that bathing was sinful. That is false. Back then, people bathed, washed their clothes with soap in rivers, there were public baths, they bought perfumes, and there were recipes for skin treatments and all that kind of thing. Obviously, the richer you were, the more you could afford a good hygiene. And obviously, if any of us traveled from the present to those times, we would be horrified by many practices, since neither Roman times nor medieval times enjoy the comforts we take for granted today. But, even with those comforts, just look at how easily the coronavirus has spread throughout the world. It is true that during the 15th century, the French church began to close down some public baths because it was said that they were dens of prostitution. But that was a specific event in a specific location and during a specific time. Medicine in the Middle Ages may not have been very advanced, but there were doctors, hospitals and all that. Some good examples are Gentile da Foligno, the Scuola Medica Salernitana and the University of Bologna, the most prestigious of its time. But it is also true that most of these schools were run by religious orders and their means acquired through donations. At the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, they blamed the disease on a planetary misalignment, and the Spanish doctor, Alfonso de Córdoba, said it had been caused by a recent earthquake in Italy, which had opened cracks in the ground that spewed gases from hell. Baghdad, Mecca, and other Muslim cities were also infected. Some doctors there refused to treat the disease because they viewed it as a punishment for the unbelievers by the will of Allah. Clearly, the golden age of Muslim science had ended several centuries earlier. In conclusion, the Middle Ages were not a good time to fall sick. By the way, there is a myth, which many of you wrote about in the comments of the original video, which says that the medieval Catholic Church burned cats at the stake for their connection to witchcraft and things like that. And this meant that without cats, rats had no predators and proliferated in the cities, spreading the Black Death even more easily. For a long time, I also believed this was true, but it turns out it isn't. It's completely false. The rumor was started by a guy called Donald W. Engels in his 1999 book Classical Cats. In that book, he says that many cats were massacred by order of Pope Gregory XI, published in his 1233 bull Vox in Drama. But actually, that bull doesn't say anything about killing cats. It just mentions a German sect which conducted rituals where they kissed toads and featuring a statue of a cat which they also had to kiss in its arse. But that's it. This false myth probably arose during the 15th century, when some cities did indeed sacrifice stray cats, dogs and other animals to prevent infections, but that was certainly not a widespread practice and took place a long time after the Black Death. The Black Death was eventually stopped when all God-fearing Christians held hands and prayed together in unison. No, just kidding. Those hands would have been filthy and they would have just spread the disease even more. Begging God for mercy was no use. That much was evident. For many, this was the apocalypse and there was nowhere to hide. It was time to think of something else. Many traditional remedies were tried, but nothing seemed to work. Doctors from different European cities reached the conclusion that an infected individual could take up to 39 days to manifest the first symptoms. And of course, you couldn't let seemingly healthy people roam around freely, because maybe they carry the disease and you wouldn't find out until 1 month later. So, the authorities of several cities, like Venice, established a new measure for those who arrived by boat from faraway places. According to this new rule, they would have to wait at least 40 days before disembarking. And that is why the measure was called quarantine, because the The Italian word for 40 is 40. Eventually, they realized that isolating patients was an excellent way of stopping the plague. It took them a long time, because back then, the idea that there were some tiny little bugs living inside of us was simply too weird. Although, a Moorish doctor named Ibn al-Khatif suspected something and prescribed isolating the diseased and burning their clothes, while another Moorish erudite, Ibn Khatima, recommended spraying the body with rosewater, lemon, and similar remedies.
Es tiempo de comer flores.
Later, people tried other ideas, such as fast burials, common graves, and burning bodies, as well as many other prophylactic measures, like isolating the diseased or covering faces with masks.
Hello!
The most famous of these masks are the ones with a beak, which was filled with aromatic plants and other substances to protect against the rotten air. But those were actually invented in 1630. Specifically, the striking design is attributed to a French doctor, Charles Delorme, who came up with it in 1620. So, if you're writing a novel about this period and it features plague doctors dressed in that outfit, I'm afraid it will be historically wrong. There were plague doctors during the outbreak we're talking about, but they didn't dress like that. They were public officials, paid by the city to help the diseased and contain the outbreak. They were even allowed to conduct autopsies on plague victims. And that is another widespread myth, that it was a sin to open up cadavers. Many new hygienic measures were adopted, such as building sewer systems in cities, not throwing shit into rivers, moving insalubrious activities to the outskirts, etc. Another famous measure were lazaretos, which were isolation hospitals designed to quarantine victims of infectious diseases like the plague, leprosy, or tuberculosis. Their name came from the order of Saint Lazarus, which cared for lepers and other disease during the Crusades. The first lazaretto used to quarantine Black Death victims was established in Venice in 1403 at a small island near the city. Its name was Lazaretto Vecchio, and it had sleeping quarters, hospitals, storerooms and gardens, and even visiting rooms so that the infected could see their relatives while maintaining a safe distance. Another small islet near Venice, called Poveglia, became a lazaretto during the modern age. It was used as a quarantine station for many years, but nowadays it is abandoned and has become a very spooky place. That was where all the bodies of plague victims were taken, until they began to pile up everywhere and had to be incinerated. Later in the 20th century, a psychiatric hospital was built on the island, and both the patients and staff told of the tormented wells of spirits which could be heard throughout the corridor. Milano and other world cities were completely locked up, to the point that any goods which arrived had to be left outside the city gates for collection. Also, infected families were confined in their homes, and their doors and windows were boarded up, so they couldn't leave until they were cured. Or they croaked. Pope Clement VI had a personal doctor who became very famous, Guy de Chaliac. This Frenchman became notorious thanks to his seminal treatise on surgery, in which he described techniques like intubation, tracheotomy and suture, and he also wrote about treatments for hernia and cataracts. He's also known for the documentation work he carried out on the Black Death at the city of Avignon. Lastly, the plague mostly wiped out the weakest individuals, leaving only immune survivors who then passed that immunity on to their descendants. In other words, natural selection. It's impossible to know the exact number because at that time they didn't keep a detailed census, but it has been calculated that the Black Death may have killed up to 1/3 of the European population, about 30 million people of the 80 million there may have been. Europe wouldn't regain its normal levels until a century later, and that isn't even counting the deaths in Asia and Africa, which also suffered outrageous losses of 40 to 60 million people. The maximum peak of infections took place between the years 1347 and 1353, although the worst and most deadly outbreaks were in 1348. Italy, southern France and Catalonia were by far the worst affected areas. Things started to settle down gradually around 1350, but there were still several subsequent epidemic waves. The outbreak of 1360 was particularly deadly for children, and the one in 1371 for grown-ups. All in all, this terrible disease kept causing panic until 1430, 80 years later, albeit periodically and in a less deadly manner. In those times, the famous French doctor, Nostradamus, was one of the many who fought the plague. The Black Death was not eradicated until the 19th century, after the so-called Third Pandemic. However, in recent times there have been some small outbreaks, mainly in Africa. For starters, so many millions of deaths takes a toll. Many cities and towns became deserted, and their fields were completely abandoned. There were also some people who thought it was the end of the world and fled as far as they could, particularly to rural areas. Which of course is great if you're healthy, because you'll be able to save yourself since you're leaving the outbreak behind. But if you are already infected, you'll just take it with you and contribute to spread the disease even further. In the aftermath, the survivors began to feel an awful existential anguish. This was natural. How the heck are you supposed to approach life after something like that? Well, there were two main attitudes. Some decided to live life to the fullest and enjoy all the earthly pleasures, while others chose to retreat from the world to earn eternal life, like flagellants who whipped themselves as a sign of penance and to purge their sins. And there also arose the cult of Saint Roch, a pilgrim from Montpellier who dedicated his life to caring for plague victims. And then of course in many places the Jews were blamed for the epidemic. They were accused of poisoning wells and corrupting the air. This kicked off the so-called Jewish pogroms, which were nothing else than group lynching, despoliation of goods, and eventually expulsion from many cities. For example, German Jews fled to Poland. In the Kingdom of Castile, they were respected for a while, but 1.5 centuries later, in 1492, they were expelled from there too. About this issue, it has been said that the Catholic Church promoted Jewish persecution, but this is not true. In fact, Pope Clement VI sought to protect the Jewish communities with 2 papal bulls in 1348, which said that blaming the Jews for the plague was the work of the devil and urging the European clergy to protect them. However, Emperor Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire turned a blind eye to the abuses against Jews because he wanted to take their properties and divide them amongst his followers. One Christian king who helped the Jews was Casimir III of Poland, who allowed them to settle in his capital, Krakow, where they founded communities which eventually became very prosperous. Interestingly, the Kingdom of Poland was one of the least affected by the Black Death, and nobody really knows why. Some say it was because of the cold temperatures, others think it was a better hygiene, and then some people believe that they just didn't bother counting the dead. The only slightly positive effect of the Black Death was that it completely eroded the foundations of the feudal system of the Middle Ages, since the disease affected both the lower classes and the nobility, and even the royalty, like with the death of King Alfonso XI of Castile during the Siege of Gibraltar in 1350. Many farms and country estates were left abandoned. The lack of workers and the brutal rising costs caused social upheaval everywhere, forcing many rulers to take measures to stop the rampant inflation. The feudal lords who ran the farmlands were disgraced when they couldn't collect the rents from their vassals, and kings began to regain an absolute power. The slow recovery at the beginning of the 15th century brought with it a gradual transition towards a new conception of the world, the modern world, an age where God was slowly relegated to a more secondary role, and was instead replaced by a humanism which placed man at the center of everything, eventually leading to the Renaissance, an age of great geographic and scientific discoveries, an age that sought to avoid at all costs another Black Death. And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.